Randy's family has quite a long legacy in the wrestling business between his father Angelo and his brother Lanny. When do you first hear about the Poffos? Is it when they start running ICW, or did you know about them before?
No, it was the first. Um, yeah, I mean, the first time I ever heard of the name of the Poffos, it was kind of essentially a four-letter word. Like, okay, and there was no such thing in these days as independent wrestling. There was, the territories and the business, and the Tennessee territory, and Atlanta territory, and Crockett in the Carolinas, and Fritz in Texas, and Blanchard in San Antonio. You kind of always heard them referred to as really the name of the promoter. Well, Crockett's doing this, or Crockett's doing that, or Geigel's doing this, or Geigel's doing that. But the Poffos were referred to as they're running their outlaw organization. And it was, yeah, it was a four-letter word that you could tell that forward facing. My dad put on the front, man, what a pain in the ass, what a nuisance they are. Behind closed doors is that they were disruptors and not good for business and causing trouble. And it's kind of the price, but it was a threat. I know, man. I'm kind of you're going to have to help navigate me because people think we're crazy. But I mean, it was. I can't say it's a life or death, but there was physical violence threatened, and there's Dundee stories, there's Dutch Mantell stories. Obviously, my dad, Lawler, Eddie Marlin, the people that were there. It was no joke during this time, like no joke at all.
When the Poffos started running ICW in Kentucky, it's Randy and Leaping Lanny as the top stars. And they're going to go on TV and start calling out and challenging Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee. They're, of course, top draws for your father's promotion. And they take this whole outlaw thing a little far. They even take out ads in the newspaper where they put 100 grand on the line if Dundee, Tojo, and your father, Jerry Jarrett, would appear. I mean, this is one of the last old school. I almost want to call it a territory battle, but I don't know that it necessarily is, but an outlaw versus a territory promotion. This has to be one of the greatest examples of that anywhere in the country, right?
Yeah, and then that's what it was. I mean, and there's look, it didn't just happen in Tennessee. I mean, there were territory battles, and most of the time they were over specific towns. And when my father and Nick split, he took the South End, as in Nick, and that was Chattanooga, Birmingham, and Nashville. My dad took, I know this doesn't sound geographically right, but Memphis, Louisville, Evansville, and Lexington. And so the Poffos, they were really Southern Illinois, Kentucky. They had an area, Bob Roop. They had some areas where they were running successfully, but they knew if they could kind of get into Louisville, Lexington, and Evansville, their circuit, their territory could become much more profitable. And you put it into context today, Conrad, it it's almost impossible to do. But when you think about another promotion running ads in the same in a local newspaper, but you're challenging other talent. Think about, hypothetically speaking, plug in any promotion you want: WWE, AEW, TNA, NWA, AAA, CML, whatever. But the promotional warfare, if you will, in the days of kayfabe, however, the business was not near as exposed. So the fan at home was like, what the hell is going on here? Because the people, the lines were so much more blurred. I'm not saying going to say they were completely blurred, but there were no internet. There were no mainstream, certainly wasn't X and Instagram, and the business wasn't exposed like it is today. So in those days, and you have this outlaw or another promotion challenging, the people believed. And the ones that were inside the business, they were like, hey man, this ain't a storyline, this is legit. And then throw in the dose of a family fighting for their lives. And that's what Angelo and Lanny and Randy were, their livelihood as far as making money. It was intense.
Meltzer's gone on record as saying a lot of the talent in Memphis wanted to respond on TV to these PAFO challenges, but I guess your dad, Jerry, totally forbid it. Meltzer would say he constantly told them, ignore them because eventually they're all just going to go away. And he said spending any time talking about them would take away from the angles they're doing and trying to draw money with. And JArrett impressed upon Jimmy Hart this advice, and Jimmy still tells that story to these days. And I think that's an important lesson. Like when he's being called out in a major way, your dad said, just ignore it. And we've seen some different promoters respond to that differently. What'd you think of that advice back then? And would you have handled it differently, do you think?
Well, you have to I've never had the blessing or the curse to I didn't live in this area. Me and you didn't live in there. All we can know about what would you do in these kind of situations. But the lesson that I was hammered in my head, and look, this is, and Conrad, we could talk about this one piece of the podcast or one piece of the topic. We could go down so many different roads because it is subjective. And my dad never lost sight. He didn't put it in those words. It's situational. But he always said, son, and he wouldn't say for the most part, but I'm going to put those, I'm going to paraphrase that in there. But that's what he believed. My grandmother believed. Never, ever, ever punch down publicly. There's no upside. There's no upside. And that was his mentality. Don't give Randy and his promotion, ICW, any of our TV time, because at the end of the day, that's really what they were fighting for. They were trying to come in, make enough noise. If they could have afforded to get on TV in Lexington or Louisville or wherever in the promotion, they would have. They would have gone and got on an opposing TV, but they didn't have the money, or it didn't fit in their business model, and they might not have got the clearance. Or they didn't have the infrastructure. Because I've always, as time's gone on, what were they really fighting for? Yes, they were trying to draw a house, but what was their end game? And I don't think they really had a specific end game other than to create a lot of noise, and they did. So maybe they had achieved their end game, but they were fighting and clawing. But yeah, Conrad, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts from a business perspective about never punch down.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was friends with some talent a few years ago, and they were sort of really struggling with that. And I gave the example, whenever there's a new car company coming out and trying to make a splash, it felt like for years they would always say, whatever the stat was, blah, 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 when compared to the new Toyota Camry. Like everybody compared themselves. So they did that same thing sort of with iPhones, like any smartphone competitor, blah, 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 when compared to the new iPhone, because those were the standards. Now, you never saw iPhone doing promos about other phone companies, and you never saw Toyota Camry taking a dunk on Kia. Like that just didn't happen. And they even created a famous marketing bit back in the 80s called the Pepsi Challenge. And they would sort of blind taste test people with Pepsi and Coca-Cola. Well, do you remember the Coca-Cola challenge? Probably not, because the shit didn't exist, because number one never talks about number two. So that's kind of always been my thought. I totally agree with your dad. And